Hello there, and welcome once again. I hope you are well wherever you may be. This week I'm going to take a long look at Beelzebub's journey through France and Paris. And I'll read out something from the sailor Francis Chichester about the heightened perceptions he experienced while sailing single-handedly across the Atlantic. Now, my boy, I wish to inform you about the specific aspects of the psyche of those three-brained beings of France, in such a way that you may at the same time realize to what extent a deterioration has taken place among your favorites in the normal capacity for crystallizing all the being data for ruminating impartially and personally, and how a subjective essence opinion is formed in them about every reality, at times entirely opposite to what it would be if they perceived that same reality directly through their own impressions. Nowadays, among the beings of all the groups breeding on the continent of Europe, where their so-called cultured existence is concentrated, as well as on all the other continents, there is infallibly crystallized from the very beginning of their formation into responsible beings, data for their image of the individuality of these French beings, which evoke in them a fixed idea that of all the beings similar to them on their planet, these French are, as they express it, the most depraved and immodest. This question interested me more and more each day because while existing among them, it gradually became clear to me that the beings of that community, France, were in fact not the most depraved and immoral, but, on the contrary, the most patriarchal and modest of all the three-brained beings grouped on the continent of Europe. So here Beelzebub is asking why people have come to have an image of the French that is completely opposite to reality. Paris was in fact empty of French people, and ruled by various gangs of foreigners, Albanians, Italians, and Americans who had taken over the bars and clubs for their own amusement, for the amusement of tourists who went there to let off steam and amuse themselves late at night. And it was these activities of the tourists and the foreigners who lived in the cities that gave rise to the image of France. But in fact, the French people themselves, who had seemingly abandoned the centre of Paris, were quite different. And in our era of increasing city living, we can see this happening everywhere. For real knowledge and real culture to exist, there needs to be this space to stratify the 7 steps of the heptaparaparshinok. It's only in that way where there is enough space that there can be a transmission of knowledge along the line. When people live on top of each other, they collapse into a lower form of life. Beelzebub talks about the heptaparaparshinok further on, when he discusses the legacy in human beings of the era of the Kundabaffa. He says, "It is true that later when this maleficent organ Kundabaffa was no longer necessary, it was destroyed. Yet again they did not foresee that by the destruction of the organ itself, the possibility was not destroyed that in the future, owing to the particular manner of existence of these beings, the consequences of its properties would be crystallized in the presence of their descendants. In other words, this time also they did not foresee that even though it was possible to destroy that organ, the fundamental cosmic law of heptaparaparshinok with its midnel-ins nevertheless remained the same as regards the evolutionary process for the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, as it is for everything else existing in the whole universe. Although on the one hand all the possibilities for coating the higher being bodies exist in their common presence, as in the presence of all three-brained beings of our great universe, it is almost impossible for them to bring the perfecting of the higher sacred parts coated in them up to the required degree, and since in accordance with the fundamental cosmic law, such formations as the higher being parts coated in the common presence of three-brained beings are not subject to decomposition on planets, and since their planetary bodies cannot exist endlessly and must inevitably undergo the process of the sacred Rascuano at the proper time, the unfortunate high-being bodies arising in these terrestrial three-brained beings must inevitably languish forever in all kinds of exterior planetary forms. Now, I have noticed, by the way, that if my own personal fantasies become extremely wild, I do feel something at the very base of the spine. But the main point for me is that on the spiritual path, you must learn how to dissolve wrong structures, because inevitably they will arise. Inevitably, wrong things have happened in the past and inside of us, and many wrong things that are the legacy of our past. Part of the spiritual path is to learn how to dissolve them using particular techniques. Repentance, penitence, recapitulation, these are all words that mean a kind of psychological undoing of wrong things inside of ourselves. And there are other ways which are energetic by nature. In other words, you seek out negative energy and you use techniques to dissolve it. Another part, of course, is to reach a higher level of functioning. Another part is to restore our basic level of functioning in the three centers. Another part is to immerse yourself in the experience of your inner being, to actually grow your sensitivity towards your soul. There are many different parts. What we see on the planet today, especially in the West, are many wrong ideas about spirituality. When Gurdjieff talks about the path being the development of our ability to do, I suppose he meant that in terms of your practical ability, but it also simply means the development of a wider powers, internal and external. It requires great skill and diligence. The human psyche has become distorted in such a way as it has made an enemy of what is real. It has become a second formation that lives in opposition to the former. And nearly all the media and emissions in our culture are based on the false self. Therefore, traditional spiritual instructions have to be understood in a certain way, as things that have managed to survive somehow in this world. Now, if we go back to Beelzebub in Montmartre, in the centre of Paris, he says, "So, my boy, sitting alone in that restaurant in Montmartre, watching those contemporary favourites of yours, I continued to reflect. How many centuries have passed since I began to observe the existence of the three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet? In the course of these long centuries, many sacred individuals have been sent from above with the special aim of helping them to deliver themselves from the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabaka. Yet nothing has changed here, and the whole process of ordinary being existence goes on just as before. During all this time I have observed no difference whatever between the three-brained beings of this planet who existed nearly 100 of their centuries ago and the contemporary ones. Are not the beings sitting here in this restaurant the same, and do they not behave just as unbecomingly as the beings of the city of Samlios on the continent of Atlantis, which in its day was considered the source and the place of concentration of the results attained in the sense of the perfecting of their reason, or, as the contemporary beings would say, their chief centre of culture, and where I also went sometimes to sit in their sakrupiaks, as they called such restaurants. After Atlantis perished, many centuries passed. The three-brained beings increased considerably, and their chief centre of culture was established on the continent of Grabonsi, which today is called Africa. Again, many centuries passed, and their principal centre of culture became the city of Korkalai, on the continent of Asia, in the ancient community called Tikliamish. In those days too, I used to sit among them in their Kaltani, which were like contemporary restaurants. Was I not a witness of similar scenes there also? There in front of me, that stout gentleman with an enormous growth on his neck, sitting with two young street girls, dress him in the costume of a Kaffirian. Would he not look exactly like that type I once saw sitting in a Kaltan in the city of Kokolai? Or, over there on the left, at that other table, the young man holding forth in his squeaky voice with such conviction to his bottle companions about the causes of the disorders in some community, put a chambardak on his head, and would he not be exactly like a real Khan of the Mountains, as they were then called? And that tall man alone in the corner, putting on airs and making eyes at a lady sitting with her husband at a nearby table, is he not a genuine Verun Kietz? And these waiters, exactly like dogs with their tails between their legs, serving the people sitting there, are they not Ascles slaves? After Tikliamish, several more centuries passed, and I happened to be in the majestic city of Babylon. Was it not the same there too? Were not the three-brained beings of that city these same Ascles, Kaffirians, Verun Kiatzes, Kleans, and so on? Only their clothing and the names of their nationalities has changed. And now, after so many centuries, I'm here again in their contemporary centre of culture, this time in the city of Paris, and again it is the same. Shouting, uproar, laughter, invective, just as it was in the city of Babylon, in Kokolai, and even in Samlios, their first centre of culture. Do not these contemporary beings gather to pass the time in a way unbecoming to the three-brained beings, as did the beings of all former periods of existence on that ill-fated planet? During all the time I have been observing these unfortunates, not only have whole peoples and many of their centres of culture disappeared without a trace, but even the very terra firma on which they existed has completely changed or disappeared from the face of the planet, as happened, for example, to the continent Atlantis. Wow, I feel energy coursing through me reading that section. It seems to me, as I reflect on all of this, it seems to me that there is something missing. And what is missing, in my opinion, and after many, many years of the study and work that I've done on myself, there is some aspect of knowledge that is missing from human beings. And it seems to be around this ego thing, those false characters that emerge there. The answer is in there. That power has to be returned to the foundation of the being. A way has to be found to do that. And that, in fact, is the majority of the work that I do on myself these days. It's very, very difficult because it involves working with different types of identity. And without learning how to do that, humanity will not change. It has not changed for 100 centuries, and it is something that they do not know. And human beings are prevented from passing this point. A few weeks ago, I talked about certain very small details that I had noticed in one of the forms that I do, the marriage of heaven and earth. Very small things that I had learnt after maybe doing it for 8 years on my own. After having been trained, it's only after very careful and diligent observation did I see that there was something wrong. And what is wrong is like this. That particular movement was called the marriage of heaven and earth. That name is treated as a kind of ceremonial old name. But it's not, because it was created by ancient people. It's meant literally. It is a way to unify the positive and negative pole within you through these movements. Today we are described as a consumer culture. If we take that literally, it means that we are a people who eat and do not create, something not to be proud about. That people don't understand what they are saying, they don't recognize the meaning, of the words that they are using. They no longer take it literally. Interestingly, I will read a third part of chapter 37, where Beelzebub describes how this situation came about. He says, and going back to the question of why the opinion of the French people had become so distorted amongst human beings. Moreover, there is still another and deeper cause for this opinion about the beings of France formed in the strange consciousness of the beings of other communities, and it is also based on one of the peculiarities of their common psyche. This peculiarity is due once again to that maleficent practice invented by themselves which they call education. The point is that from the very first day of a child's appearance on God's earth, as they express it, while nature herself is still developing this prime conception of a future three-brained responsible being, your favourites begin to hinder their development by the same maleficent education of theirs. And that is not all. By their pernicious practice of educating, they stuff and hammer into the specie to Arlitivian concentrations, or as they would say, the brains of these newly born beings, all kinds of ephemeral and fantastic ideas. These brains are in general localized in beings for the perception and accumulation of all kinds of impressions and of the results of conscious being awareness, and among the newly born they are still quite pure and receptive to the highest degree. The greatest misfortune for your favourites is that this maleficent process continues for most of them almost up to the age when they should already be responsible beings, and the result of all this produces that peculiarity of their common psyche I mentioned, which consists in the following. First, almost all of their functions intended for active being manifestations adapt themselves little by little to responding only to the sum of these false and fantastic ideas. And second, the whole presence of each of them gradually becomes accustomed to perceiving all new impressions without the least participation of the being factors that nature put into being for new perceptions. In other words, to perceiving new impressions only according to the false and fantastic notions that have previously been inculcated in them. The contemporary three-brained beings there ultimately lose even the very need for grasping in its entirety everything they see or hear for the first time, so that what is newly seen and newly heard merely serves as a shock, arousing associations based on information previously implanted in them and corresponding to these new impressions. And I notice very much in young people, particularly in Britain, how their parents teach them to be world leaders and to work on saving the world and the climate and all these big ideas, all these fantastical ideas. And after these fantastical ideas have been put into young people, can they see the world? Can they consider their own life? Can they feel anything anymore? That is what I see outside today. I was sitting at the back of the church on Sunday, looking at the field in front of me and feeling the whole building around me. It's clear to me that I can sense everything around me instantaneously, as if I was connected to it in some way. Somehow I can feel at a distance the difference between a stone pillar and a wooden screen, between the people and the tiles on the floor, between the bright points of the candles lined up in a row in the distance. I can feel them from here. How, I don't know. I have to investigate. The amount of information that I can sense around me and immediately grasp is extremely vast. Going back to Gurdjieff's experiments, it says, one end of this astonishing connector was fitted to our temples by means of appliances on the helmets, while the other end was fastened to a so-called ANS commutator, in its turn connected by wires to all the objects that had to be visible during the experiment, both those inside and outside the Hrakatsaha. It is interesting to note here that at each end of this appliance, a creation almost incredible for the reason of an ordinary three-centered being, were attached two further independent connectors, also of wire, through which special magnetic currents flowed from outside. As it was afterwards explained to me in great detail, these connectors had been invented by that truly great scientist Gurdjieff, so that by virtue of a certain property of these magnetic currents, also discovered by him, the presence of learned three-centered beings, even those not perfected up to the sacred Inkotsano, might be reflected in their essence. And thanks to another property of these currents, the presence of the objects mentioned above might also be reflected. Thus it was possible for their imperfect organs of being sight to perceive these objects, even in a vacuum containing none of the factors or results of the various cosmic concentrations which are animated by those vibrations that alone permit the functioning of any being organ whatsoever. Here Beelzebub is starting to talk about the real world, which is uncomfortable to say the least. I was in Waitrose, a supermarket here, the other day, and uncharacteristically buying roast chicken at the counter when a young British woman served me. She sounded like she came from a high level of education or an old family, and here she was manning the chicken counter. That is one of the policies of the British government, who want to promote everything in Britain apart from their own survival. And on the wall of the supermarket, hanging behind this young woman, was this flag. If I try to read what this flag means, starting at the right hand side and working backwards to the left, there are three parts of undoing. The first is that when something white is destroyed, it bleeds the 7 colors of what was inside of it. In order to do that, you need a black triangle to push into it. And behind the black triangle there is a brown force that comes in afterwards to support it. And the result on the left hand side is that what was red, white and blue is now a bit gay. The use of the black and brown triangles is unusual, as it is a psychological device that is not part of Christian culture. Psychological twisting is not something that is inside Christian culture. Now this week I've been thinking about people falling away. As you get older, you see people who once had very loud voices fading away, and you realize that ancient wisdom and religion is true, and that bravado doesn't last. Here in Europe, Norway is a very esteemed country, but I saw some things this week that shows to me how poisonous it is to be a vassal. This man is in line to the Norwegian throne. He's in the royal family. This lady is a Norwegian princess who's just married a Haitian voodoo Los Angeles celebrity therapist. And the Norwegian king released this statement today. Norwegians are married, unmarried, divorced, families and old couples. Norwegians are girls who love girls, lesbians, boys who love boys, sodomites, and girls and boys who are fond of each other. Norwegians believe in God, in Allah, in everything, in nothing. In other words, Norway is you. Norway is us. The internet and the social media is destroying the minds of most of the people on this planet, of any class, of any stature, of any religion, of any race. It will bring a lot of people down. by the end, little, I think, will be left standing. Well, if we return to better times in Britain, Sir Francis Chichester crossed the Atlantic, I think in 33 days in the Gipsy Moth 3. At the height of the journey, after days and nights ploughing through the crests and troughs of the Atlantic, exhilarated and alone, he wrote this: "The magic of the voyage was in my blood. It was sheer joy to set or trim a sail to keep Gipsy Moth sailing at her best. It was sport getting over difficulties. I laughed at incidents like coming across that steamer on the Grand Banks. It began to seem as if life was a joke and should be treated as one. I was bursting with fitness and joie de vivre that seemed to build up after a few weeks alone. Perhaps it had taken 3 weeks to shed the materialism of ordinary living. I had become twice as efficient as when with people. My sensations were all greater. Excitement, fear, pleasure, achievement, all seemed sharper. My senses were much more acute, and everything was much more vivid, the shape and colour of sky and sea, feeling spray and wind, heat and cold, tasting food and drink, hearing the slightest change in the weather, the sea, or the ship's gear. I had never enjoyed anything more than that marvellous last 1,000 miles, sailing along the eastern seaboard of North America. On the 27th of June, the day's run was 132.5 miles. At 9 p.m. I turned in early. The wind was backing, and I expected to be called out soon. At 11 p.m. I woke and lay listening to Gipsy Moth riding madly through the night. It was rough going, but also it was intensely exhilarating, and I lay there for some time pondering whether I should let her carry on. Goodbye, take care, and thank you for listening.